Chapter 11. Evidence for the Kushites. 3-4. If the 25th dynasty had played a central part in turning back Assyria, it logically would have obtained political and commercial advantages in much of Kor that are consistent with having been the conflict's winner. Evidence abounds so long as Sennacherib remained on Assyria's throne, Egypt enjoyed such conditions. Indeed, these indications are so plentiful that it is hard to understand the prevailing scholarly conclusion that in these decades immediately following the invasion of Egypt possessed little, if any, influence in the region, while Assyria under Sennacherib continued to enjoy considerable clout, even if this was not a heavy-handed overlord. What sort of role in Kor would have been in the 25th dynasty's self-interest? Kushite Egypt would not have sought to exercise outright military dominance in the region. The problems would have far outweighed the benefits. For one thing, Kushite Egypt would have required a vast standing army in Kor to prevent an Assyrian return. If Kush had been unable to leave an occupying army in the place in Lower Egypt after Pa's conquest of 728 BC, it is most unlikely that it could have left such an army in place in an even yet more distant place, Kor, a generation later. The Chpt co-regency had its hands full of simply keeping Egypt united. To have attempted such a role would have left its forces dangerously overextended, even if, for the sake of argument, one were to say that Kushite Egypt somehow could have mustered the manpower to stand up permanently to the Assyrian powerhouse in Kor. The effort would have been prohibitively costly. In theory, perhaps, Kushite Egypt's military occupation of southwestern Kor could have helped pay for itself through the economic advantages that often occur to a country when it dominates another. Yet in this particular case, this is most doubtful. An Egyptian experience several centuries before had demonstrated that such an occupation would bring little net economic gain, if any. Under the 18th and 19th dynasties, Egypt had occupied Canaan, the name often used for southwestern Kor, including Philistia, and the land that would eventually become the Hebrew kingdoms. For these new kingdom pharaohs, this overlordship proved to be no bonanza. Unlike lumber-rich Phoenicia, Canaan could provide Egypt with few products or commodities, including foodstuffs, livestock, and metals. That it did not possess already. That is the surprising finding of Shemuel Ahituv, a Hebrew University scholar who investigated the economic benefits that Egypt derived from the occupation of Canaan. He concludes, it is indeed probable that there is no economic interest in the Egyptian conquest of Canaan. And if such an interest existed, it was very limited. The main advantage Egypt appeared to have derived from Kor was control of trade routes. By the time of the 25th dynasty, Egypt was in a position to know the outright political dominion over Kor would be far more trouble than it was worth. For reasons of both commerce and defense, the ideal would have been to keep the southwestern Kor as a neutral zone free of a threatening Assyrian presence. One of the fascinating archaeological discoveries that relates to Kush is a fragment of clay seal that bears the identifications of both the kings of Egypt and Assyria. This thin object is about the size of a postage stamp. According to its 19th century discoverer, the celebrated British archaeologist Sir Austin Henry Layard, it would have probably have been attached to a papyrus or parchment document that has not survived, kept at Sennacherib's palace of Kuyunjik, located at Nineveh. The clay bears the impression of two signet rings. Layard, who excavated this palace, has identified one of the rings as having belonged to Shabako, who we now believe was the senior of the two pharaohs. Most likely, he says, the other ring was Sennacherib's. Layard concludes, it would seem that a peace having been concluded between the Egyptians and one of the Assyrian monarchs, probably Sennacherib, the royal signet rings of the two kings, thus found together, were attached to the treaty, which was then deposited amongst the archives of the kingdom. James Henry Breasted leans towards Layard's view that this artifact is just a treaty. The seal, he remarks, may indicate some agreement between the two nations. Yet, Breasted expresses no curiosity about such a pact, since he starts from the premise that Sennacherib deposed of Taharka's army without difficulty. He can rule out the need for any after-the-fact diplomacy, although some later scholars have sought to assign the seal to matters unrelated to 701, their attempts are weak. Let us try to deduce the sort of peace that such talks would have produced. Negotiations would have involved not just Egypt and Assyria, but the members of the rebel coalition, including Judah. At this parley, Assyria, despite having failed to beat back the 25th dynasty's army, still held some very high cards. It had the potential to return to Kor and finish what it had started. Once the armed conflict was over, Egypt could negotiate from a position of strength, but this strength was highly qualified. This is because Egypt lacked the means to hold on to Kor. It would have been unable to deter Assyria from storming back a year or several years later once it was back to proper strength. Nor did Egypt, with its limited objectives of foreign trade and security of its own borders, need to rule Kor. That helps explain why Sennacherib was able to exact heavy terms from Hezekiah. Judah had to give some of its territory to those Philistines who had been loyal to Assyria, says Sennacherib of the Judahite king, "His towns, which I have plundered, I took away from his country and gave them to Mitini, king of Ashdod, Padi, king of Ekron, and Silebel, king of Gaza. Thus I reduced his country." In addition, Judah had to pay a painfully large sum in gold and other treasure, as well as an unspecified number of elite soldiers and court hostages, including Hezekiah's daughter and concubines. One gathers that the daughters were not princesses. Sennacherib does not refer to them as royal daughters. One assumes, too, that once the daughters had arrived in Assyria, they were attached to Sennacherib's own court. Perhaps significantly, Sennacherib says in his annal that Hezekiah did send me later this treasure and these people. Why later? Why did the Assyrians not carry everything to Nineveh at once? Sennacherib's withdrawal was impromptu, so that important treaty details may have been crafted afterward with the help of diplomats who, seeking a durable peace, tried to leave all sides reasonably satisfied. One has to assume that Hezekiah agreed to these painful terms because he understood that Sennacherib, despite his withdrawal, was not really defeated. He would have to know just how easily Assyria could return to complete the devastation that the pharaoh had been able to interrupt. One can call Hezekiah's payment a bribe, a tribute, or indemnity, or because the penalty also included giving over his own concubines and offspring. One can also call it collateral, a guarantee to Sennacherib that for the sake of the hostages he would not again anger Nineveh by, for example, trying to regain territory the treaty had transferred to the Philistines. Finally, because Hezekiah also gave over to Sennacherib some top soldiers, one can see the penalty as a practical limitation or handicap in the event that Jerusalem were again to feel militarily mischievous. Still, from Hezekiah's viewpoint, the pact was not, on balance, negative. Far from it, by allowing Sennacherib to save face and making it worth that foe's while and never to set foot in Judah again, Hezekiah ensured two huge benefits: the survival of his war-torn kingdom and its existence as a quasi-independent state. Hurtful as would have been the loss of loved ones, treasure, and territory, these represented a pittance compared to the gain. The 25th dynasty, of course, also gained. No evidence exists that it obtained a military victory in the conventional sense of the word. It achieved something better, An outright battlefield triumph, including the death or imprisonment of Sennacherib, might have invited Assyrian vengeance. Or in the event that Assyria would have been so weak that Babylon could have finished it off, the advent of another bellicose Mesopotamian superpower. Indeed, when Babylon vanquished Assyria less than a century later, it did not invade Kor repeatedly. It did invade Kor repeatedly. The negotiated settlement gave Egypt the two things it needed: security and commercial access to Kor. It also spared Egypt the need to lay down in the region an onerous military and economic infrastructure. For the pharaoh, a stalemate meant a de facto victory. During the several decades after the conflict period, the 25th dynasty's political and commercial interests flourished. Without a strong negotiating position, it was hard to imagine how Egypt could have obtained such favorable terms. That in turn suggests it earned substantial leverage for itself through actions closely linked to Sennacherib's rushed departure from Judah. Although Sennacherib ruled for the next 20 years, he never returned to Kor or threatened Egypt. Most certainly, this was not due to any mellowing on Sennacherib's part. To the end, this man, who would soon call himself king of the four quarters of the earth, would relish teaching the disrespectful, terrible lesson. The most chilling example of this took place when in 689 he finally put the Babylonians in their place by sacking Babylon, slaughtering its soldiers, and razing the buildings. Then, to prevent the capital's rebirth, he destroyed the foundations of the building, removed the surface soil, and even dug canals through the midst of the city in order to turn the site into a swampland. It appears to have been one of the more complete systematic eradications of a major city in recorded history of ancient warfare. Yet Kor and Egypt were spared this man's capacity for vengeance. After the conflict of 701, it is not only Judah that avoided becoming an Assyrian province. No, none of its Philistine partners in the anti-Nineveh coalition did either. No evidence exists to indicate that Judah or the Philistine city-states continued to contribute to Nineveh's coffers after making the initial payment called for in the settlement. But even if they had, they appear to have enjoyed, in Ayim Tadmor's words, de facto independence in the years after 701. Egypt had the buffer it wanted, and there is no evidence to suggest that Assyria kept so much as a trade garrison close to Egypt's Sinai border. Another indication of an understanding between Sennacherib and the allies is that the Assyrians mounted a new invasion of Kor in Egypt almost immediately after Sennacherib's death in 681. His successor would have seen the peace and Kor policy as something to which an individual ruler had committed himself and to which they themselves were not bound. In the 33 years up to and including 701, Assyria invaded Kor 6 times. Now, starting in 679, or within 2 years of Sennacherib's death, Assyrian armies would return with dogged regularity to Kor. In 679, 674, 671, and 667, Assyria mounted expeditions that reached the Egyptian border or beyond, a policy that climaxed in the capture of Thebes in 663. With this ferocious pattern, it's easier to appreciate how the peace between Assyria and Kor Egypt had lasted 21 years represented a truly radical shift in Nineveh's foreign policy. No other theory for Sennacherib's withdrawal can account for this extraordinary hiatus. Assyria might have left Judah alone if it were paying bounty as tribute, but that would not explain why during this period the empire did not even try to attack the land that was so patently the apple of its eye, Egypt itself. Here's another clue to the Kushite dynasty's role in the region. 26 years after he led the expedition into Kor, and 15 years after becoming pharaoh, Taharka inscribed a remarkable address to Ammon in the walls of the Theban temple. In the message, chiseled in hieroglyphs, Taharka seeks the god's help in a crisis which, while not identified, appears to be Assyrian tide. The line that concerns us most is that which refers to your tribute of Kor, which has been turned aside from you. The 675 inscription strongly implies that until Assyria's aggressive return to the region, Kor had been rendered some sort of tribute to the Kushite had been rendering some sort of tribute to the Kushite dynasty's principal deity. Tribute in this context does not necessarily imply a strict ruler vassalship. What is certain, however, is that receiving tribute means wielding a degree of political influence. It could also mean providing some sort of protection. This powerful role does not in itself prove that Egypt carried the day against the Assyrians in 701. Had Assyria withdrawn to deal with some troubles elsewhere or to flee in an epidemic, one could try to argue that Egypt rushed into Kor to fill the vacuum. But tribute is more consistent with the idea that elements in Kor's recognized Egypt as instrumental in driving the Assyrians away and deserving its due. Also, tribute implies that Egypt had a credible ability to continue looking after the region's interests short after posting a standing army there. Short of posting a standing army there. The fate of the key city of Gaza is another indication of who came out on top in 701. In prior decades, Sennacherib's two predecessors, Tiglath-Pileser and Sargon, had captured the southernmost of the 5 Philistine city-states. Gaza was of special importance to Assyria because of its proximity to Egypt and also because of its commercial dealings with Arabia. For caravans from the Great Desert Peninsula, Gaza stood at the gateway to Kor. Tadmor goes as far as to say, controlling Gaza, Assyria would extend her control further into Arabia. For Egypt, Gaza was even more important. It held the key not only to its own caravan traffic to and from Kor, but to its own defense. We might reasonably expect the political status of the city, which both Assyria and Egypt so valued, to serve as a test of a new power relationship between the two adversaries in this post-701 period. In Sennacherib's own records, in his Annals of 701, he boasts that he installed loyal vassals to replace the rebel rulers in the Philistine cities of Ashkelon and Ekron. One may assume this bombast obscures the fact that in order to establish a political equilibrium in the region, these vassals were acceptable to Egypt, and that Philistia became, in Tadmor's words, a semi-neutral buffer area between Assyria and Egypt. But what is striking is this. In his list of cities that swore loyalty to him, Sennacherib omits Gaza. Some historians have claimed that in the years after the conflict in 701, Sennacherib was still the overlord of Kor generally. For this, they offer no hard evidence, but if, for the sake of argument, one allows that they are right, these historians cannot possibly extend this hypothesis to the specific city-state of Gaza. Sennacherib himself does not make the claim. The 25th dynasty, then, was indisputably able to deny Sennacherib any sway over the strategic city so valued by both sides. Another sign of Egypt's influence in Kor is trade. In 734, having made themselves masters of the eastern Mediterranean coast, the Assyrians had prohibited the Phoenician city of Sidon from selling Lebanese lumber to Egypt or its Philistine intermediaries. Assyria had wanted the wood for itself. The famous cedars were a valued commodity in the country as well as in Egypt. Lacking suitable trees themselves, both nations required foreign sources of high-quality lumber for colossal construction projects and ships. No import-export records exist for this period, but when Taharqa rebuilt the Temple of Ammon in Kawa, he left behind a list of donations of precious objects that he made to the temple. The list includes prized cedars of Lebanon to build the massive doors, as well as juniper and acacia wood that also appeared to have come from Kor. From this record, Anthony Spallinger draws the reasonable conclusion that in his first decade as pharaoh, 690 to 680, Taharqa was able to show complete disregard for the import ban, as well as to exhibit close connections with Phoenicia. Excavators' discoveries also buttressed the idea that Kor and Egypt enjoyed robust commercial ties under the 25th dynasty. The most compelling is the finding of a distinctive system of weights. Weights, of course, are an integral part of commerce. Buyers and sellers need to measure the quantities of goods, Archaeologists have collected more than 200 such weights, inscribed with hieratic numerals, scattered about in territory that corresponds to southwestern core. They found most of these in Jerusalem, but significant numbers have also come to light in the Lachish region and the Negev. While the majority hail from Judahite territory, a few also turned up in such Philistine centers as Ekron and Gezer. The weights are dome-shaped and made of limestone. In a meticulously researched book on these artifacts, published in 1998, University of Haifa historian Raz Kletter says that the level at which these objects were buried clearly indicates their use began in the late 8th century BC, during Hezekiah's reign, and they became commonly used in the 7th century BC. One important thing, says Kletter, is puzzling. The weights, shape, hieratic numeral inscription, and units of measure all indicate that the weights were based on a system that Egypt had devised centuries before and was still using at this time. The weights would thus have been useful for trade in Egypt because the heavier of them bear numerals that match Egyptians' own weight units. The historian deduces that they may have been used for trade in metals like gold, silver, and copper, and also perhaps for incenses and spices. For Kletter, the finding that Judah would have begun to borrow the weight system in the late 8th century presents no problem, since the kingdom at the time was trying to break away from its status as a vassal to Assyria and was friendly with Egypt. What he finds curious is the boom in usage of the Egyptian-style weights came later, in the first half of the 7th century. Operating on the widespread assumption that Assyria had regained control over Judah at the time, Kletter says one could expect the vassal kingdom to show closer relationship with the ruling empire rather than with Egypt. Yet no appreciable traces of Mesopotamian weights have turned up in the region. Of course, if one assumes that after 701, Assyria did not have a major presence in core, and that Egypt did, the situation instantly becomes logical. Adoption of the new system attests to the likelihood that Judah's trade relations with Egypt were strong. It is no simple matter for a country to adopt an unfamiliar system of measure. Witness North America's qualms with going metric. To accept such a change in habits, ordinary people would have to feel if it was in their economic self-interest. For Kletter, the archaeological evidence is consistent with a high degree of popular acceptance. He notes that while some of the weights have been found in government buildings and public locations, which indicates the royal officials used them, most were discovered in domestic sites. This would suggest, he says, that it was not just a thin layer of civil servants under the king's command that used them, but the population as a whole. These weights, in short, represent first-class evidence that Egypt's post-701 profile and commercial life of core was robust and pervasive. In the aftermath of the conflict of 701, then, Kushite Egypt enjoyed political and economic benefits that were thoroughly consistent with having bested Assyria militarily. In offering an alternative explanation to these benefits, the various alternatives, surrender, troubles elsewhere, and disease, all fall flat. Indeed, it strains the imagination to think of any other circumstance besides a military stalemate or defeat when confronting the 25th dynasty forces that could have compelled Sennacherib to make such a strategic concession not only to Judah but in core generally. And an additional reason for thinking that Kushite Egypt repelled Sennacherib is its subsequent reputation for extraordinary military prowess. After Sennacherib's withdrawal, there is little question that in the next 20 years or so, Egypt did include much of core within its sphere of influence. The term sphere of influence is used here in a loose sense. It does not mean that Egypt would necessarily have been an occupying power or exercise outright control over the area, but rather that it had free commercial access to it, not necessarily to the exclusion of the Assyrian traders. During Sennacherib's reign, core may have been a demilitarized or lightly militarized zone for all parties. Neither Egypt nor Assyria nor their respective allies in the region would have maintained enough troops in the region to represent a potential offensive threat to the other. That could explain why Sennacherib relinquished his best soldiers to Assyria as a part of the peace agreement. If Egypt or Assyria maintained military personnel in the region at all, they may well have been there as monitors, making sure that the other side did not cheat. Taharka's strategy towards Assyria would have been two-pronged. He would have sought at all costs to avoid rousing the imperial beast and giving it reason to attack. At the same time, he would have sought to avoid appearing to be a military weakling, a monarch unwilling to protect his realm commercial and security-related interests in core. Reconciling these two stances would have meant walking a fine line. The philosophical basis for this cautious strategy would have been the need to uphold Ma'at, behaving in an upright manner to achieve harmony. Assyria would have represented the ultimate example of isfet, or chaos. Ma'at was the best way, perhaps the only way, to hold it back. The outcome of the earlier confrontation with Sennacherib may also reflect this same philosophy. Just as Taharka's father, Pa, had forgiven his enemies, including the traitorous Namlot, after his conquest through Lower Egypt, so the Kushite leadership may have calculated that allowing Sennacherib's safe return to Nineveh with a face-saving diplomatic agreement was the best way to achieve political harmony. With generosity can also go self-interest. That Kushite Egypt played so important a role in core after 701 does not in itself prove it would have acquired that prominence because of its performance in Judah in 701. Theoretically, it is barely possible, though hard to imagine, that Egypt would have been ineffective against Sennacherib, and yet somehow have become a major factor in core only a few years later. It requires far less effort, however, to regard Egypt's clout as a natural consequence of strong military showing in 701. That is the simplest solution. To understand the true strength of the dynasty's forces, we need to bypass historians' dismissive assessments, go back to ancient sources, and take a closer look at Assyrians' relentless series of aggressions against Egypt in the post-Sennacherib period, because we have no Kushite or Egyptian records of those attacks, which eventually shattered Kushite control of Egypt forever. Mesopotamian texts will have to do. In 679, according to an Assyrian annal, Sennacherib's brother, King Esarhaddon, campaigned into core as far as the Egyptian border, near the frontier. He destroyed an obscure town that was loyal to Egypt. The annal offers no motives for the campaign, but Tadmor makes the reasonable surmise that this was essentially a show of force, demonstrating that Assyria alone ruled in Philistia, and warning Taharka against any attempt to assert himself in the area. In 677 and 676, he returned to the Mediterranean, warring against unbowing Phoenicia. He destroyed one great port city, Sidon, and intimidated the other, Tyre, into paying tribute. Then, in 674, he took the great step of invading Egypt itself. Taharka turned him back by defeating him outright. Again, Assyrian texts shed no light on the political situation that produced the offense, nor do they say how far into Egypt the army advanced. They did not even mention the failed 674 campaign at all. It is only from the cursory reference in the Babylonian record that we know of Assyria's expedition. Our entire knowledge of the abortive invasion is limited to these few words by the Babylonian chronicler. The army of Assyria was defeated in Egypt. The various rulers in Kor saw this Egyptian victory as no lucky fluke, and the various rulers in Kor saw this Egyptian victory as no lucky fluke is clear from an annal from 671. By way of explanation for laying siege that year to stubbornly insubordinate Tyre, Esarhaddon says that the city-state's king, Baalu, had put his trust upon his friend Tirhaka and had thrown off the yoke of Ashur, answering my admonition with insolence. Clearly, Tyre had confidence in Egypt's ability to stand up militarily to Assyria. It was not alone. Farther south along the coast, the Philistine city-state of Ashkelon also aligned itself with Egypt. So perhaps did Judah. The king at the time was Hezekiah's son, Manasseh. The Bible says that the commanders of the army of the king of Assyria took Manasseh captive in manacles, bound him with fetters, and brought him to Babylon. The text does not suggest when this would have taken place or why, but the arrest may well have stemmed from Judah's pro-Egyptian sympathies in the decades following 701. Kogan says that Manasseh had presumably sided with the anti-Assyrian coalition of Tyre, Ashkelon, and other cities aligned with Taharka. This expert on the period adds, we can only imagine the terms under which Esarhaddon reinstalled Manasseh on the throne. But if similar reports from the annals are any indication, the renewed pledge of loyalty and increased tribute headed the list. This idea that Assyria forced Manasseh to renounce a pro-Egyptian foreign policy is eminently plausible. Assyria's Esarhaddon himself feared Egypt. On a rock near Beirut, bits of an inscription he ordered written have survived. The inscription, which had been dated to 671, is in the form of a series of questions that King Esarhaddon poses to the oracle god, Shamash, in hope of learning whether it would be wise for Assyria's army to proceed to Ashkelon. Referring to himself in the third person, the king asks apprehensively, will he return to Assyria safe and sound? Then he asks an additional question. If he pitches his camp in the region of Ashkelon, will the Kushite Egyptian forces plan and strive to wage war in any way? Referring to himself, the king's anxiety peaks. Will they defeat him? Thy great divinity knowest. His trepidation before Egypt's might is plain. The correct answer to Esarhaddon's urgent question would turn out to be that no, Taharka apparently did not send forces to confront him at Ashkelon, or, for that matter, elsewhere in Kor. These events yield three solid pieces of evidence that in early decades after the 7th century BC, Egypt posed military capability of the first magnitude. Egypt possessed military capability of the first magnitude. Egypt in 674. First, in 674, Taharka's army vanquished Assyrian aggressors on Egyptian soil. Second, Tyre and Ashkelon allied themselves politically with Egypt as late as 671. Other kingdoms may have done so, including Judah. That these states preferred Egypt to Assyria may reflect their confidence in Taharka following his success against Esarhaddon's invasion in 674, yet it would surely have been difficult for Tyre's king to place his trust in the 25th dynasty if, as most historians insist, Egypt had let Kor down in 701. Similarly, if Egypt had turned out to be a weak reed that the Rab Shakah had indicated in his speech at Jerusalem's wall, it is hard to imagine that Judah might want to lean again on it so soon. Finally, in the Ashkelon-related inscription of 671, the extraordinarily cocky Assyrian king revealed to a deity his severe anxiety about again clashing with Taharka. Egypt's obvious might that year is fully consistent with the idea that Egypt was strong enough to have turned back Sennacherib. The fact that later in 671, Assyria went on to defeat Taharka inside Egypt, a severe setback from which the Kushite pharaoh would recover a few years later, takes nothing away from the sense that Egypt under the 25th dynasty was, for Assyria, a most worthy battlefield opponent. Still, a skeptic might note that this prowess in 674 does not prove anything. Even if Kushite Egypt had failed against Sennacherib in 701, it still had 27 years in which to recover and improve its army greatly. In theory, so thunderous a comeback from a dire defeat is perhaps possible, but by looking at Kushite Egypt's enduring reputation for military prowess, even after its ultimate defeat by Assyria in the 660s, we can appreciate the slimness of that possibility. Two different ancient texts uphold this reputation. The first is a statement by the biblical prophet Nahum, who preached in the 7th century BC. One of his themes was Assyria's destruction in 663 of Thebes, was one of his themes was Assyria's destruction in 663 of Thebes, the political capital of Upper Egypt, and because it was Amon's city, the cherished spiritual capital of the 25th dynasty. Nahum says of Thebes before her destruction, Cush and Egypt were her boundless strength. One translation calls this strength infinite. By Egypt, of course, Nahum means the Egypt of the 25th dynasty, which in 663 was still in power in Upper Egypt. Would a Judahite living so recently after the siege of Jerusalem be apt to exalt Kushite Egypt's military power if it had failed against Sennacherib? The second text is from Strabo, the Greek historian of the 1st century BC, compiled a kind of honor roll of underrated military leaders of the earlier centuries. Strabo reflects on how some great figures of the past are no longer household names. Certain expeditions of princes to lands far remote are because of their distance in time, not matters of offhand knowledge to everybody. Strabo then adds, I refer to Medes the Scythian, Derarco the Ethiopian, Cobas the Treran, Sesostris and Psamticus the Egyptians, and to Persians, Cyrus to Xerxes. Derarco is Taharka. The company in which Strabo places Taharka is elite. Cyrus the Great was founder of the Persian Empire and liberator of the Jews in the 6th century BC. Xerxes was one of his successors who, prior to the Greeks' celebrated victory against him in the naval battle of Salamis, had put down revolts in Egypt and Babylon. An army of Psammetichus, also known as an army of Psammetichus II, also known as Psamtik, the 26th dynasty pharaoh, invaded Kush and inflicted upon it serious defeat in 591. While Sesostris is little known to us today, he was truly a mighty figure of Egyptian legend. His persona was a composite of several historical pharaohs. Alan Lloyd sees him as an amalgam of Sesostris I and the Third, both of whom expanded Egypt's hegemony over Kush and defeated Libyans on Egypt's western frontier. The British Egyptologist describes the two as monarchs of outstanding capacity and energy, whose activities inside and outside of Egypt left an indelible mark on Egyptian history. As well, Lloyd detects in this composite hero the presence of perhaps the most famous of all the pharaohs, Ramses II, who led a military expedition as far as Syria. Regardless of the precise historical elements the legend may contain, what matters is that at the time of Strabo, many Egyptians would have regarded Sesostris in terms that Lloyd describes as the embodiment of a pharaonic ideal. It is too bad, however, that Strabo does not identify the heroic events that led him to mention Taharka in the same breath as these other military figures. If we apply rigorous logic, we cannot jump to the conclusion that the Napatan necessarily joined this illustrious circle of military leaders because, or even partly because of success against Sennacherib in 701. Conceivably, Taharka could have earned his laurels for achievements sometime in the next 37 years of his life. We have, however, scant evidence of what those exploits might have been. In the unlikely event that Strabo does have in mind some foreign expedition in the 690s or 680s BC, such a feat would have been in addition to a strong performance in 701. It is hard to imagine a scenario in which Kushite Egypt, having fared poorly against Sennacherib, might somehow vault only a few years later into the ranks of superachievers on foreign soil. Four ancient sources, then, each from a different culture, attest the military muscle of Kushite Egypt in the aftermath of the deliverance. One source, Babylonian, indicates Taharka defeated an Assyrian army inside Egypt. A second text from an Assyrian king suggests that Taharka was strong enough for the great trader for the great trading center of Tyre to place its trust in him. Another source, a Judahite prophet, says that Cush's might seemed limitless. And the fourth, a Greek, says Taharka's foreign exploits rank among the great feats of military history. While none of these sources specifically states that Kushite Egypt turned back Assyria in 701, its capability to have done so is obvious. We're rather a long way from the view of the influential William Adams, Dean of Specialists on Kush and champion of the epidemic theory, that Taharka is one of the most unsuccessful military commanders in history.